Japanese prisoners watched moving pictures appear inside a wooden box with no film projector, no screen, just images floating in glass. 3 of them refused to go near it for a week. One tried to find the hidden projector behind the wall. They called it devil magic and demanded to know what Americans had done to capture souls inside the box. November 1945. The war has just ended. A group of Japanese POWs waiting for repatriation are being held at a camp in California. One evening, guards wheel a large wooden cabinet into the common room. It has a small glass screen on the front. The guards plug it in, turn some dials, and suddenly there are people inside the glass, moving, talking, performing. The Japanese prisoners back away from the device. Some drop to their knees. Others start praying. One prisoner draws a picture of it in his notebook and writes next to it, "American sorcery. Cannot explain. Must be lie." But it's not a lie, it's television. And it's about to completely shatter these prisoners' understanding of what's technologically possible. To understand why television broke Japanese prisoners' minds, you need to understand what they knew about technology in 1945. Most of these men had seen movies before. Japan had cinemas. They understood that you could capture images on film and project them onto a screen using a projector. That made sense. You could see the projector, see the film reels, understand the mechanical process. It was technology, but technology you could comprehend. Radio was similar. Voices coming out of a box seemed strange, but you could understand the concept. Sound waves traveling through the air, being picked up by an antenna, converted back into sound. You couldn't see radio waves, but you could accept that they existed because you'd been told about them and the explanation made logical sense. But television was neither of those things. There was no film, no projector, no visible light source creating the image. Just this box with glass on the front, and inside the glass people were moving around, talking, performing. It looked like a window into another place. But it couldn't be a window because you could see the back of the box and there was nothing behind it except wires and glass tubes. So where were these people? How were they inside the box? How were they moving? The guards tried to explain it. They said it was like radio but with pictures, electromagnetic waves carrying images through the air. A camera captures the image, converts it to a signal, broadcasts it, and your television receives the signal and converts it back to an image. The Japanese prisoners nodded like they understood, but they didn't understand. Not really. The explanation was too far removed from anything they'd experienced. "You're telling me there's invisible waves carrying pictures through the air right now, and this box catches them and turns them into people I can see." One prisoner who spoke decent English kept asking the same question over and over. "Where are the people?" The guard would say, "They're in a studio in Los Angeles." The prisoner would say, "No, where are they really?" The guard would repeat, "In Los Angeles, about 50 miles from here." The prisoner would point at the screen and say, "But they're right there. I can see them. They're in the box. How did they get in the box?" The first night the television was in the common room, most prisoners wouldn't go near it. They stood at the edges of the room, watching from a distance. A few braver ones approached slowly, like they were approaching a dangerous animal. They'd lean in close to the screen, looking for the trick. One prisoner put his hand behind the television, waving it around, trying to figure out if there was a projector somewhere casting the image. There wasn't. The screen showed a variety program. Singers, dancers, comedians, all performing live from a studio somewhere in California. The prisoners who were watching couldn't reconcile what they were seeing with what they knew was possible. One prisoner became convinced that the performers were tiny people who'd been shrunk down and placed inside the television. He asked a guard if this was true. The guard laughed and said no, they're normal-sized people in a studio, we're just seeing their image. The prisoner asked how you capture someone's image and send it through the air. The guard said honestly, "I don't really know how it works either, I just know it does." That answer actually made some prisoners feel better. If Americans didn't fully understand their own technology, then maybe it wasn't magic. Maybe it was just very advanced science that looked like magic. But other prisoners took it as confirmation that this was dark sorcery that Americans were playing with without understanding the consequences. Over the next few days, the television became the most discussed topic in the camp. Prisoners who'd been there longer tried to explain it to newer prisoners, but their explanations didn't help because they didn't really understand it themselves. They'd say things like, "It's like radio, but you can see it," or "There's a camera that captures light and turns it into signals," or "The screen has special coating that glows when electricity hits it." These explanations were technically sort of accurate, but they didn't address the fundamental question: how do you make people appear inside a box? Some prisoners developed theories. One popular theory was that the television was recording everything in the studio onto some kind of medium, maybe magnetic tape, and then playing it back instantly. This seemed more reasonable than the idea of images flying through the air. But guards explained that no, it's happening right now, this is live. If you were in that studio right now, you'd see these same people doing these same things. The prisoners couldn't accept this. How can something be happening 50 miles away and also happening right here at the same time? One evening, a guard brought in a newspaper that had the television schedule printed in it. He showed the prisoners that you could look up what would be on television at what time. Tonight at 8, there would be a comedy show. At 9, a drama. The prisoners watched as the shows changed exactly when the schedule said they would. This proved that it was planned, that someone was controlling what appeared on the television, but it still didn't explain how the images got there. A few prisoners refused to watch television at all. They said it was unnatural, that humans weren't meant to see things happening in distant places. One prisoner who was particularly religious said that capturing someone's image and transmitting it was like capturing part of their soul. He wouldn't look at the television directly. He thought that by watching, you were participating in something spiritually dangerous. But most prisoners were fascinated. They'd sit in front of the television for hours, just watching. American variety shows, news programs, whatever was on. They didn't understand most of what was being said because the audio was in English, but they didn't care. They were mesmerized by the technology itself. The fact that this was possible, that this existed, that Americans had built machines that could do this. What really got to the prisoners was realizing that television wasn't new or experimental. The guards talked about it like it was normal. Some guards mentioned having televisions at home. There were advertisements on the television for products you could buy. This wasn't some secret military technology. This was consumer technology. Regular Americans had these boxes in their houses. They could sit in their living rooms and watch performances happening across the country. The implications of this were staggering. If America had developed television to the point where civilians owned them, what else had they developed? What other technologies existed that the prisoners didn't know about? Japanese propaganda had told them that Japan was technologically superior, that Japanese engineering and innovation would win the war. But Japan didn't have television. Most Japanese people had never even heard of television, and Americans were treating it like it was no big deal. One prisoner who'd been an engineer before the war spent days examining the television, trying to understand how it worked. He looked at it from every angle. He asked guards if he could see inside. Eventually, a guard who was interested in electronics opened up the back panel and showed him the vacuum tubes, the wiring, the cathode ray tube that produced the image. The engineer looked at all these components and understood each individual piece, but he couldn't understand how they worked together to produce a coherent image. It was like looking at the parts of a car and knowing what each part did, but not understanding how they combined to make the car move. This engineer started explaining to other prisoners what he'd learned. He drew diagrams showing how electrons hit phosphors on the screen to create light, how the image was scanned line by line, so fast that your eye couldn't detect it and you just saw a complete picture, how the signal was modulated onto a carrier wave and broadcast through the air. His explanations were accurate, but they didn't help. The other prisoners would listen, nod, and still not really get it. The gap between "I understand the words you're saying" and I comprehend how this is possible, was too large. What made it worse was watching Americans interact with the television. They were casual about it. They'd turn it on, watch for a while, get bored, turn it off. They'd complain about the programming. Nothing good on tonight. They'd adjust the antenna to get better reception and complain when the picture was fuzzy. To Americans, television was just another appliance, like a radio or a toaster. It was useful, sometimes entertaining, but not miraculous. To the Japanese prisoners, this casual attitude was almost insulting. How can you be bored by magic? How can you complain about a miracle? These Americans had technology that shouldn't exist, and they were annoyed that the picture wasn't clear enough. The prisoners realized that this was the fundamental difference between Japan and America. Americans had so much technological advancement that they took miracles for granted. The moment that really broke Japanese prisoners came about 2 weeks after the television arrived. A guard mentioned that there were multiple channels. You could turn a dial and watch different programs from different studios. He demonstrated switching between channels. One channel had news, another had a baseball game, another had a cooking show, all happening simultaneously, all being broadcast to this one television. Prisoners couldn't handle this. One television receiving multiple different broadcasts at the same time. How? The guard explained that different stations broadcast on different frequencies, and the television could tune to whichever frequency you wanted. Like how a radio could pick up different stations. But that explanation didn't help because now the prisoners had to accept that there were multiple television stations, each with their own studios, each broadcasting constantly, all at the same time. One prisoner did the math. If there are 5 channels, that means 5 separate studios, each with performers, cameras, equipment, technicians, all working constantly to create programming. The amount of resources required to do this was incomprehensible. And this was just in one city. Guards mentioned that other cities had their own television stations. New York had television. Chicago had television. How many television stations were there in America? How many people were working in television? How much money was being spent on this technology? And this was 1945. The war had just ended. America had been fighting a massive 2-front war, producing ships and planes and tanks and ammunition in quantities that dwarfed what Japan could produce. And somehow, during this same time period, they'd also developed television into a commercial industry. They'd built studios, manufactured televisions, trained technicians, created programming, all while also fighting the largest war in human history. A group of prisoners sat down and tried to comprehend what this meant about American industrial capacity. They knew America was wealthy. They'd seen the evidence in the camps. Good food, new equipment, casual abundance of everything. But television was different. Television wasn't just having a lot of resources. Television was having so many resources that you could afford to invent an entirely new technology and deploy it commercially while also fighting a world war. One prisoner, who'd been a teacher before the war, said something that stuck with the others. He said that Japan had spent the 1930s preparing for war, building up the military, training soldiers, producing weapons. America had spent the 1930s inventing television. And somehow America still won the war. What does that say about the difference in capability between the two countries? The story of Japanese prisoners encountering television is really about technological culture shock. These men came from a country that was advanced for its time. Japan had radio, movies, electric lights, modern infrastructure. They weren't primitive people encountering technology for the first time. But television was so far beyond what they thought was possible that it seemed like magic. What made it worse was that Americans treated it as mundane. There was no sense of wonder, no appreciation for the miracle of technology that let you see things happening 50 miles away. Americans would walk past the television without looking at it. They'd complain about the programming. They'd fidget with the antenna trying to get better reception. To them, television was just another appliance that didn't work quite as well as they wanted. This casual attitude toward advanced technology was perhaps more shocking than the technology itself. It revealed a society where innovation happened so fast that yesterday's miracle was today's boring appliance. Japanese prisoners realized they hadn't just been fighting a country with more resources. They'd been fighting a country that existed in a different technological era. The television became a symbol of why Japan lost, not because of any single battle or strategy, but because the technological and industrial gap was so massive that Japan never had a chance. A country that could develop television into a commercial product while fighting a world war was operating on a different level than a country that was struggling to feed its soldiers. Some prisoners who returned to Japan after the war would tell people about television and not be believed. Their families and friends would think they were exaggerating or had been brainwashed by American propaganda. How could there be boxes that show moving pictures with no projector? That's impossible. But it wasn't impossible. It was just American. When television finally came to Japan in the 1950s, some of these former prisoners were among the first to buy sets. They wanted to show their families that they hadn't been lying. Look, see, this is what I told you about. This is what I saw in the camp. This is real. And their families would sit in front of these televisions with the same confused wonder that the prisoners had felt years earlier in California. The really interesting part is that many of these prisoners, once they got over the initial shock, became enthusiastic about television. They'd watch anything that was broadcast. They'd try to understand how it worked. They'd ask guards questions about programming and transmission. This wasn't just curiosity. This was a recognition that if Japan wanted to catch up to America, Japanese people needed to understand and embrace this kind of technology. Years later, some of these former prisoners would work in Japan's growing television industry. They'd tell their coworkers about the first time they saw television and how it seemed impossible. And they'd explain that the lesson wasn't that Americans were smarter or better. The lesson was that Americans were willing to invest in crazy ideas that might not work. Television seemed impossible, so they made it possible. That willingness to attempt the impossible was what gave America its technological edge. But in 1945, sitting in a POW camp in California, watching images float inside a glass screen, none of that was clear. All the prisoners knew was that they were seeing something that shouldn't exist, that defied their understanding of what was possible, that proved beyond any doubt that they'd been fighting an enemy they never really understood. The television sat in the corner of the common room, broadcasting shows to men who'd spent years fighting against the country that created it. And every night it reminded them that they'd lost to a nation that could turn magic into a consumer product. Subscribe to see what other American technology shocked Japanese prisoners.